Hi, my name is Kelp, and this is the Lion of Poetry. Today we focus on the traditional short form developed in the 9th century in Japan called haiku. Haiku consists of 3 lines, with the first line having 5 syllables, the second line 7 syllables, and the third line back to 5 syllables. Total in the whole poem traditionally is 17 syllables. The origin of haiku is actually from a much longer poetic form, a kind of progressive poem, where one poet would compose the first 3 lines, followed by a second poet who would add to the poem with 2 more lines. And then continuing in this progressive fashion, they would create a very long poem of literally over 100 lines. This was called haku. The word haiku is derived from the word haku, which was this progressive type of poetry. Haiku literally means starting verse. So they basically extracted the first 3 lines from the longer haiku poem to create haiku. Now, the beauty of haiku poetry is in its concise form. There's no wasted words. The poet has to come to the point. In this way, I would say haiku is a kind of essential poetry. When I say essence, I mean there's usually 1 or 2 images, usually contrasting images, that are represented in the poem. And that surprise that you get from the contrast of the images is, in Japanese, called kareji, the surprise in the poem. It's the revelation in the poem. Nature is often the subject. The Japanese revered nature, and this was a way to show in these short poems an appreciation for not just nature, but the details of nature, the small details that are often overlooked. Considered the greatest haiku poet and the pioneer of haiku poetry is Matsuo Basho, who lived from 1644 to 1694. Matsuo Basho wrote the classic haiku poem. In Japanese, it follows strictly the 5-7-5 syllable pattern, but in translation, we just see it as a short poem. If you count up the syllables, you won't get a total of 17 syllables. The kareji in this poem is the splash, where the frog is jumping into the water and we hear the splash. It's kind of the awakening of the poem that creates the desired effect. So here is the famous splashing frog haiku, the mother of all haikus, by Matsuo Basho. An old silent pond, a frog jumps into the pond. Splash, silence again. And here is another famous haiku by Basho. See if you can determine where the kirji is in this haiku. Autumn moonlight, a worm digs silently into the chestnut. Another of the great haiku masters who lived from 1763 to 1828 was Kobayashi Ise. He made the haiku more immediately accessible to wider audiences. O snail, climb Mount Fuji, but slowly, slowly. Everything I touch with tenderness, alas, pricks like a bramble. A world of dew, and within every dewdrop, a world of struggle. A third Japanese haiku master was Masaoka Shiki, who lived from 1867 to 1902. And he was credited with bringing the haiku form from the ancient to the more modern format. I want to sleep, swat the flies, softly, please. The summer river, although there is a bridge, my horse goes through the water. Shiki was born in Matsuyama City, which has become the site of an annual haiku festival. And in the city, on street corners, you can find haiku writing stations, which provide paper which is pre-formatted and writing tools, which allow individuals to write haiku poems on the street. There are also postal boxes nearby where you can mail your completed poems to a friend, a relative, or even to yourself. And it's also very common in Japan to see people with notebooks throughout Japan who are able to spontaneously write haiku poems as they experience nature throughout the day. Now, over time, the 5-7-5 syllable pattern became much more relaxed, particularly as the haiku was translated and adapted into other languages, including English. In fact, many modern Western poets don't subscribe to the 5-7-5 pattern at all. The haiku still retains its format of 3 lines, and it still has that kariji, that surprise, which comes from contrasting images and surprises the reader in the process. A good example of the modern haiku in English was Ezra Pound's famous poem called In a Station of the Metro. What we see in Ezra Pound's simple poem is, again, this contrasting of 2 very different images. This is the central metaphor of the poem, the faces of the crowd in the metro compared to petals on a wet black bough. This poem by Ezra Pound is said by many to be the first haiku in English. In a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. The Beat poets, who we talked about a few episodes ago, were fascinated with all things related to Eastern cultures and Eastern religions. And as such, they very much admired the haiku form. Jack Kerouac, for example, wrote hundreds of haiku poems. Here's an example of one of Kerouac's poems in the haiku form. Nightfall, too dark to read the page, too cold. Here is an example of a modern haiku by the contemporary poet Sonia Sanchez. Love between us is speech and breath. Loving you is a long river running. As many of you know by now, I'm a big fan of comedy, and the haiku is an easy target for spoofing and parodying. So I'll give you a few examples of some funnier haikus. Some of these humorous haikus are just as profound as the serious ones. World is vast and wide, so much out there to explore. Right now, let's eat lunch. Wherever you go, there you are. Your luggage is another story. Accept misfortune as a blessing. Do not wish for perfect health or a life without problems. What would you talk about? Breathe in, breathe out. Forget this, and attaining enlightenment will be the least of your problems. If you Google haiku, or if you look on YouTube and search on the word haiku, what you'll find is mostly how-to videos on how to write a haiku poem. Because it's so accessible, it's become very popular among people of all ages, including children, and it's captured the imagination of people throughout the world. One of our goals in the Lion of Poetry project is to be open to other cultures and other traditions, and to appreciate the inspiration and influence that these traditions have. As is the case with haiku, which has by now transcended Japanese culture and has become an art form for everyone and anyone, anywhere in the world. This, as we have said so many times before, is one of the reasons why poetry is so important. It takes us out of ourselves, out of our limited frames of reference, and helps us to better understand our fellow human beings. So until next time, signing off from the Lion of Poetry.
これ落ちて消えてく言葉はそのまま風に揺れる